The war dog walked into the emergency room and stopped dead. Not from pain, not from fear. He had survived ambushes, IED blasts, and 3 combat deployments without flinching. But something in that sterile, fluorescent-lit animal hospital made the 100-pound German shepherd freeze mid-step, ears locked, body rigid, black nose working the air like he was reading a language nobody else in the room could hear. Then he turned, past the handlers, past the uniformed men, every person in that room who outranked him. He walked straight to the quiet nurse in the corner, and when his massive head dropped against her hand, slow, deliberate, unmistakable, every SEAL operator in that room went very, very still. Because military working dogs don't do that. Not for strangers. Not ever. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this channel is where the stories nobody talks about finally get told. The ones buried under paperwork and classified stamps and 5 years of silence. Hit the like button if this already has your attention. And drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next inside Harlow Peak Veterinary Trauma Center is going to change everything you think you know about the woman who called herself Dana Reeves. Storm came in off the mountains fast, the way storms always did in Harlow Peak, without warning, without apology, just a wall of black cloud that swallowed the ridgeline and turned the highway into a river of standing water inside 20 minutes. By 9:15 that Tuesday night, the emergency bay at Harlow Peak Veterinary Trauma Center had been slammed with 3 back-to-back intakes, a golden retriever with a leg fracture from a traffic accident, a barn cat somebody had found half-drowned in a drainage ditch, and a Belgian Malinois mixed with a suspected bowel obstruction who had screamed through his entire intake and was now sedated and stable in Bay 2. Dana Reeves had been on her feet since 6 that morning. She didn't complain about it. That wasn't her way. She refilled her coffee somewhere around hour 11, drank half of it cold while she was charting, and kept moving. That was the thing people noticed about Dana. She never stopped moving, but she never looked rushed. There was a quality to the way she worked that was hard to name. Efficient wasn't quite the right word. It was more like she had already thought 4 steps ahead and was simply executing what she'd already decided. And nothing that happened in the room surprised her enough to break the rhythm. Dana. Marcus Webb, the night shift vet, leaned out of Bay 1 and snapped his fingers. He was 29 years old, board certified, and deeply in love with his own opinion. The fracture case needs a new IV line. The first one blew. Already on it, she said, without looking up from the Malinois chart. Marcus leaned back inside. He never thanked her. That wasn't his way either. She had been working at Harlow Peak for 3 years. Before that, according to her resume, she had spent 2 years at a small clinic in rural Montana and completed her veterinary nursing certification through an online program after a previous career in the paperwork, said administrative support for a logistics company. It was a clean, sensible, completely unremarkable employment history. Nobody had ever looked at it too closely. People rarely did when someone was as quietly competent as Dana Reeves. She was 34, average height. Brown hair she kept pulled back in a low bun because it stayed out of the way. There was nothing about her face that demanded attention, no striking feature, no memorable quality. She had the kind of face that people forgot immediately after meeting her and then felt vaguely guilty about forgetting. She had cultivated that effect deliberately, though nobody at Harlow Peak knew that. She reset the IV line on the golden retriever in 4 minutes flat, caught a vein on the first attempt, cured the tape in a particular cross pattern that was slightly different from how anyone else at the clinic did it, a habit she'd picked up from a field corpsman 8 years ago and never been able to shake, and moved on. The rain intensified. The lights in the trauma bay flickered once, held. At 9:47, the radio on the front desks crackled. Jolene Marsh, the overnight receptionist, picked it up with the practiced boredom of someone who'd taken 1,000 late calls. She listened for 6 seconds, and then her posture changed. Dana noticed it from across the room. The way Jolene's shoulders went up, then very deliberately back down, a slight tightening around her eyes. "Copy that," Jolene said into the radio. "We'll have trauma bay cleared." "Ida?" A burst of static. A voice that sounded clipped, controlled, and not particularly interested in being polite. 8 minutes. Jolene set the radio down and turned to the room. "Got a military working dog inbound. Handler says the injury is significant, possible shrapnel wound left flank, coming in off Route 9. Military? Marcus appeared in the bay doorway again. From where? There's nothing out here. They didn't say. Jolene was already pulling the intake paperwork. They asked specifically for whoever our senior trauma nurse is. Marcus straightened. I'm the attending vet. They asked for the nurse. Small silence. Dana set down her chart. I'll prep trauma bay. She moved into the back room without waiting for Marcus to weigh in, which he was already doing behind her. Something about protocol and chain of command, and the fact that military liaison cases were supposed to go through the administrator. She stopped listening after the first sentence. She had learned a long time ago that certain kinds of noise were best filtered out early. She laid out the trauma kit with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Gauze, irrigation saline, hemostatic packing. She reached for the clamp and then stopped. Her hand was perfectly still. She looked at it. Then she picked up the clamp and kept moving. They heard the vehicles before they saw them, two black SUVs with no visible markings and a government plate format that Jolene later described as not standard anything I've ever seen. They pulled into the emergency bay with the practiced precision of a convoy that did not stop at things like parking lines or visitor spaces. The lead SUV went half up on the curb, and nobody from the team seemed to notice or care. 4 men got out of the first vehicle. Dana was standing in the doorway of the trauma bay when they came through the entrance, and she processed them in the half-second before anyone spoke. Tactical build, civilian clothes that weren't quite civilian. The cut was wrong. The pockets were wrong. The way they moved was very wrong for people who were supposed to be ordinary. The one in front was built like a door and had a scar across his left jaw that had healed badly, which meant it hadn't been treated when it should have been, which meant he'd been somewhere that didn't offer that option. Late 30s. Eyes that did a complete sweep of the room in under 2 seconds and then settled. The dog was in the second vehicle. She heard him before she saw him, not whimpering, which would have been normal for an injured animal. A low, controlled sound, almost like a vocalization of discomfort rather than fear. Disciplined even in pain. She recognized that too, though she didn't examine why. 2 handlers brought him through on a rigid carry litter, moving fast. The German Shepherd was large, 90, maybe 95 pounds, with a brindle coat and a tactical vest that had been partially cut away from his left side. The wound was visible, a 3-inch laceration, deep, with what looked like fragment involvement. He was bleeding but controlled. His breathing was fast, but not panicked. Bay's ready, Dana said. Bring him through. The man with the jaw scar looked at her. You're the trauma nurse? Yes. He didn't say anything else. Stepped aside and let the handlers bring the dog through. Marcus appeared at Dana's shoulder. I should lead this. You should pull up the surgical kit from the back cabinet, she said quietly. The good one, not the standard. Second shelf, left side. He blinked at her. Please, she added, and walked into the trauma bay. The dog's name, according to the handler who introduced himself only as Garrett, was Strike. Strike, Dana said, not loudly, just at normal conversational volume, while she was setting up the tray. She said it the way you'd say a word to test how it sounded in the room. Strike's ear moved. He responds to voice, Garrett said. He was standing at the edge of the bay with the specific stillness of someone who was used to waiting and did not like doing it. He's been in the field 6 days. This happened in the last extraction point. We caught a fragment in the sweep coming out. How long ago? Hour and 40 minutes. You applied packing? First aid kit. Standard mil spec. She nodded, pulled on her gloves, and moved to the table. Strike was watching her with the particular focused attention that working dogs had, not aggressive, not friendly, just absolutely present. She reached for his muzzle, not to restrain, just to make contact first, and he let her. His nose worked at her wrist. Something shifted in his posture. It was subtle. She would have missed it if she hadn't been watching. His body, which had been held in that disciplined tension since they brought him in, released about 10%. Not a lot. Just enough to be visible if you knew what you were looking for. Garrett noticed. Huh, he's stressed, Dana said. It's normal. No, Garrett stopped. Looked at the dog. Looked at her. He doesn't usually do that with strangers. I'm not a threat. Animals can read that. She focused on the wound. The packing had done its job. The hemorrhage was controlled, which meant they'd had someone who knew what they were doing apply it, which told her something about the team. Fragment was visible on the surface, which was good. She irrigated, assessed the depth, and reached for the clamp with her left hand while she kept her right on Strike's shoulder. She worked left-handed with complete fluency. Her chart said she was right-handed. Nobody in the room caught it, except the man with the jaw scar, whose name she didn't know yet, and who was standing in the doorway, watching her, with an expression that wasn't concern for the dog. It took 40 minutes. The fragment came out clean, a small irregular piece of metal that she placed in a specimen cup without comment. She closed the wound in layers, which was a technique that went slightly beyond standard veterinary nursing practice, but which she executed without hesitation. Marcus, to his credit, didn't say anything. He'd come in partway through, seen the way she was working, and quietly handed her things when she needed them, without being asked. When it was done, Strike was sedated, stable, and breathing evenly. Garrett let out a long breath. Good work. He'll need 48 hours minimum before any activity, Dana said, pulling off her gloves. The suture line will hold if he doesn't stress it, but that left flank is going to be tender for at least a week. Understood. Who's his handler? His actual handler, day to day. Garrett's expression flickered. He doesn't have one right now, he said. His primary handler was KA 8 days ago. The room absorbed that quietly. Dana nodded once. I'm sorry, she meant it. That was visible too. And Garrett seemed to register it, because something in his posture changed slightly. The professional distance dropped about an inch, which was probably the most it ever dropped. I need to make some calls, he said. Is there somewhere? Front desk can set you up with the conference room. Jolene will help you. He nodded and left. The two other operators who'd been standing in the bay entrance moved with him. The room emptied. Dana began cleaning up the tray. She was alone with the dog. Strike was under sedation, but his eyes were half open. The way dogs sometimes were, that slightly eerie, not quite asleep state where the body was resting, but the brain hadn't fully let go. His breathing was slow and even. She checked his vitals, noted them on the chart, and then stood for a moment with her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She just stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she heard the fourth man come in. She hadn't actually forgotten about him. She'd logged him the moment the team came through the door, the one who hadn't moved from the back wall of the lobby since they arrived. Not a handler. Not the same build as the operators. He wore a jacket over a button-down and carried himself differently, not military trained. Or not recently. Government, probably. The kind of government that carried briefcases and security clearances and questions. He stepped into the trauma bay doorway. He was maybe 45, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the kind of tiredness around his eyes that didn't come from one long night, but from a lot of them stacked up over years. Ms. Reeves. She kept her back to him, finishing the cleanup. Yes. I'm sorry to bother you after all that. I just had a couple of routine questions. Standard protocol when military assets receive civilian medical treatment. Sure, she said. Go ahead. How long have you been at this facility? 3 years. And before that? Montana. Small practice outside Billings. And before that? She turned around then, because the pacing of the questions had shifted. They were come slightly faster now, and the gaps she'd expect between them weren't there. He was moving through a checklist, not making conversation. Administrative work, she said. I answered this on my original employment paperwork. Right. He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Of course, I'm sorry, we just have to verify. Bureaucracy. I understand. He looked past her at Strike. Remarkable animal. He is. Served 4 deployments, quite a record, he paused. His previous handler was with a classified joint unit. SEAL-attached medical extraction team, actually. Not a lot of people know those exist. Dana said nothing. Fascinating specialty, the man continued, conversationally, like they were discussing a hobby. Combat medics attached to K9 units. Very specific training. Not many people come out of that pipeline. Strike's ear moved. The man looked at the dog. Then he looked at Dana. He really did settle quickly for you, he said. Animals usually take longer with strangers. Told your colleague I'm not a threat. Animals read that. Yes. He nodded slowly. He said you told him that. Another pause. I've watched a lot of handlers work with Strike over the past week. Experienced people. People who are trained specifically for animal rapport. And he didn't settle for any of them the way he settled for you, in about 30 seconds. He tilted his head. It's interesting, don't you think? The fluorescent light above them hummed. Outside, the rain hit the roof in a steady sheet. Strike's half-open eyes were tracking between them. I think animals are unpredictable, Dana said. That's what makes them interesting. The man reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small folded piece of paper. He set it on the edge of the instrument tray gently, like it was fragile. Found something interesting in our intake paperwork tonight, he said. Your certification number. The one on file with this clinic. He touched the paper. Real. Completely legitimate. But the timeline on your Montana employment when I ran the cross-reference this evening, there's a gap. 8 months. Between when you left Montana and when your certification was issued. He looked at her. People take breaks, of course. That's normal. But combined with the other thing. What other thing? He nodded toward Strike. The way he looked at you when you walked in, he said quietly, before you ever touched him, before you spoke, the moment you walked through that door. He picked up the paper, folded it again, put it back in his pocket. I've been doing this job for 19 years, Miss Reeves. I have learned to trust what a well-trained working dog tells me about a room. Dana's expression didn't change. But something behind her eyes went very still, the specific stillness of a person who is not afraid, but who has just understood that the conversation they are having is a different conversation than they thought it was 2 minutes ago. I'm a veterinary nurse, she said. I've been one for 5 years. I believe that, he said. And then, very carefully, I'm just not sure that's all you've been. He excused himself politely and walked back toward the lobby. Dana stood in the trauma bay with the sleeping dog and the rain on the roof and the folded paper she hadn't touched, and she felt for the first time in 3 years the very specific sensation of a perimeter being walked. She looked down at Strike. His eyes, half open, were on her face. His tail moved once, just once, low and slow, like a flag being raised in a place where flags weren't supposed to exist. Put her hand on his shoulder. Easy, she said. Easy. She didn't know if she was talking to the dog. She picked up her chart. She walked out of the bay. She went back to work, because that was what she did. She kept moving. She kept her rhythm. She did not let the room see her hands. And from across the lobby, the man with the gray temples watched her go and reached for his phone. The man with the gray temples, she heard later his name, was Aldrin Voss. Though he hadn't offered it, made 3 phone calls in the conference room over the next 40 minutes. Jolene, who had no business being near that hallway and knew it, lingered by the supply closet twice and caught fragments, words like verification and cross-reference, and once, very clearly, the phrase "she fits the profile" before the door closed, and his voice dropped below audible range. Dana heard none of this directly. Jolene told her later, in a whisper, while Dana was restocking the medication cabinet and pretending to be interested only in the medication cabinet. I don't know what that's about, Jolene said. But that guy gives me a really bad feeling. He's doing his job, Dana said. His job involves asking questions about you specifically. Animals receive military treatment. They log the facility staff. Standard protocol. She said it the same way she'd said it to Voss. Flat, factual, nothing attached to it. It happens. Jolene gave her the look she always gave when she didn't believe something, but couldn't prove it. It was a good look. Jolene was smarter than the clinic gave her credit for, which was a pattern Dana had noticed in a lot of people who spent their days answering phones and getting treated like furniture. Okay, Jolene said. Not okay at all, and went back to the front desk. Dana finished the medication cabinet. She made a note on the restocking log. She did not look toward the conference room. She had learned a very long time ago that looking toward a thing was the same as pointing at it, and she had no interest in pointing at anything tonight. The rain hadn't let up. Strike was stable, sedated, vitals running clean. Marcus had gone back to his other cases with the particular energy of someone who wanted to demonstrate that he was above caring about whatever weird dynamic had just played out in his trauma bay. The other 2 operators, the ones who'd come in with Garrett, were somewhere in the lobby. Dana had glimpsed them through the window, standing rather than sitting, backs to the wall, watching the parking lot. Just watching the way people watched when they'd learned that parking lots could become problems. She understood that instinct better than she was supposed to. 11:20, Garrett found her in the break room. She was standing at the counter eating cold rice from a container she'd brought from home, not sitting, just standing, one hip against the counter, eating without really tasting it the way she did when she needed fuel and didn't have the bandwidth for anything else. Stood in the doorway. He was big enough that he filled a reasonable portion of it. You haven't taken a break in. I'm taking one now, she said. He looked at the rice. That's a break? It involves not doing anything medical. So yes. He almost smiled. Not quite. He came in and sat down at the small table, which she hadn't invited him to do, but she didn't say so. because the man's dog had just had surgery and he was allowed to sit somewhere. How long before he's out of sedation? He asked. Another 3 hours, roughly. 4. He'll be groggy after that. Will he know where he is? He'll be confused. That's normal. He'll orient to you when he sees you, which will help. Garrett was quiet for a moment. His hands were folded on the table, large hands, scarred across the knuckles in a way that told a story he hadn't been asked to tell. He looked at the table rather than at her. He lost his handler 8 days ago, he said. Since then he won't work with anybody. Won't take commands. We had to put him in the truck to get him out of the field because he kept going back. Dana set down the fork. Going back where, she asked. To where Declan went down. He said the name without ceremony, which meant the grief was old enough to carry quietly. Strike found him first. That's his training locate, alert. And he just stayed there. Wouldn't leave. The break room was very quiet. He's not broken, Dana said. He's grieving. They do that. I know. It doesn't mean he's non-functional. It means he lost something real, and his nervous system knows it. Garrett looked up at her then. He had the kind of eyes that took things apart, steady, methodical, cataloging. He looked at her the same way the dog had, which was probably not a coincidence, because people trained alongside working on dogs long enough started to share certain habits without noticing. You know a lot about working dogs, he said, for a veterinary nurse. It's my job. Sure, he said. And then like Voss, that particular pause, that wasn't quite a pause. Very calm for someone who's been worked over by a government investigator tonight. The fork back up. He asked standard questions. Voss doesn't do standard. Garrett leaned back slightly. I've been on 4 ops where he was the debrief lead. He doesn't do anything that isn't already halfway to a conclusion when he starts. Dana ate a bite of rice. It tasted like nothing. I don't know what to tell you, she said. I'm a nurse. I treated your dog. That's what happened here tonight. Garrett nodded slowly. He stood up. He was almost at the door when he turned back. Strike settled for you in 30 seconds, he said. He hadn't let anyone touch him in 8 days. I just thought you should know what that means to me. He paused. Whatever else is going on, thank you for what you did for him tonight. He left. Dana stood in the break room with her cold rice and the fluorescent buzz of the overhead light and the rain on the window. And she stayed very, very still for almost a full minute. Then she rinsed the container, put it in her bag, and went back to work. It was 12:40 when Strike came out of sedation. She wasn't supposed to be in there. Marcus had technically signed off as attending, and the overnight monitoring was Priya's responsibility, Priya Solon, the other night shift nurse who had arrived at midnight with coffee and a podcast and cheerful ignorance of everything that had happened before she clocked in. But Priya had the barn cat and critical watch in Bay 3, and Dana was passing Bay 1 anyway, and Strike was starting to move. She slipped inside. He was on his side on the padded table, blinking slow and thick, with sedative limbs, making the small, uncoordinated movements of a body trying to remember how to work. His eyes found her in about 4 seconds. She watched the focus come back gradual, effortful, like a camera adjusting in low light. Easy, she said quietly. You're okay. You're in a safe place. He made a sound. Not distress, something lower than that. Ignition. She sat down on the stool beside the table and put her hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. She stayed like that for a while. The monitors ran their quiet rhythms. The rain kept at the windows. Strike's breathing slowed and steadied. She was thinking, and she was aware she was thinking this, which was itself a problem about how long she had. Not tonight, specifically. In general. How long a careful, unremarkable life stayed unremarkable when something like tonight happened. Voss was already cross-referencing. Garrett had noticed things he'd been trained to notice, and Strike had done the things she'd hoped dogs were too complicated and too species-specific to do, which was recognize something that she had spent 5 years rebuilding from scratch. She had chosen Harlow Peak deliberately. Small city, not remote enough to look like hiding, but not large enough to have the kind of institutional memory that created problems. She had chosen veterinary nursing because it was adjacent to her actual training without being identical to it. She had been careful. She had been so careful. Strike's ear turned toward the door half a second before it opened. She had just enough time to pull her hand back and pick up the chart from the hook before Voss stepped in. He looked at the chart in her hand, then at her, then at Strike, who had oriented toward him with a specific watchful stillness. How's he doing? Voss asked pleasantly. Coming out of sedation normally. Vitals are stable. Good. He came further into the bay. He had that quality that certain people had: not aggressive, not threatening, just slightly too comfortable in spaces that weren't his. Like every room was already his room, and he was simply allowing other people to use it. I wanted to apologize for earlier. I'm aware the questions felt pointed. They're your job, Dana said. They are. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Strike. Beautiful animal. Quite a history. He tilted his head. You know, his unit designation is redacted from the standard medical file, the one we provide to civilian facilities. Most people never notice that. Dana said nothing. You didn't ask about it, he continued. Most veterinary staff, when they're treating a military working dog, they're curious. They ask questions, unit deployment history, that sort of thing. He glanced at her. You didn't ask a single question about where he came from or what he'd been through. You just started working. He had a wound that needed treating, Dana said. That was the relevant information. He nodded. Practical, focused. He looked at Strike again. The thing is, Miss Reeves, his file, the real one, not the redacted version, it indicates he was assigned to a joint medical extraction unit for the last 18 months. A very small team, highly classified. He paused. That unit lost 3 members in an operation 14 months ago. The remaining personnel were reassigned, or in some cases documented as missing. Strike's eyes were on Voss. The dog did not like him. That was clear. He wasn't aggressive. He was too trained and too medicated for that. But there was a quality to his attention that was different from how he'd looked at Dana or Garrett. Alert, tracking, cautious. Missing, Dana said. That's unfortunate. It is. Voss turned back to her. The unit had a medical officer, female, exceptional record, 2 commendations, 3 successful extractions under combat conditions, 1 incident that was listed as a weapons systems failure, but that several surviving members maintained was something else entirely. He watched her face. She disappeared after the debrief, left no forwarding contact, cleared out an apartment in Virginia Beach, and he spread his hands. Gone. The monitor beeped. Dana checked it, made a note, did not look at him. That must have been very hard for her family, she said. She didn't have much family. That was noted in the file. Another pause. She did have a dog, briefly, for the last 6 weeks of her deployment. A German shepherd she worked with after the unit's primary handler was injured. Apparently the dog bonded to her specifically unusual, given the short timeline. Strike made a sound, not loud, just a low, quiet vocalization that filled the room for a second. Voss looked at the dog. Then he looked at Dana. And for the first time that night, the pleasant professional distance in his expression cracked just slightly, not into hostility, but into something more complicated. Something that might have been the actual human being behind the investigator, looking out for just a second. You can keep doing what you're doing, he said quietly. You're very good at it. I want you to know that I can see that the discipline involved in building this life. 3 years of good work. A clean record, people who trust you. He held her gaze. Strike recognized you from across a room after 14 months and a combat injury and the loss of ancestors, and working dogs don't do that for people they met once. He let that sit. So whatever your reasons were, and I'm not here to judge the reasons, I think we both know what tonight actually is. Dana set the chart back on the hook. She looked at him directly. She had a good face for this. It didn't broadcast much when she needed it not to. Think, she said, that you've had a long night and you're drawing very long lines between very small dots. She moved toward the door. I need to check on my other patients. He stepped aside. He let her go. But as she passed him, he said very quietly, not for the room, just for her. The operation was called Kestrel Margin. She walked out of the bay. She kept her pace even. She turned left toward Bay 3, where Priya and the barn cat were, because that was where she'd told him she was going, and changing direction now would be visible. She did not react. She did not react. She pushed through the Bay 3 door and stood inside it for a moment, with her back to the small window in the upper panel, and she breathed. Once. Twice. The barn cat was in an oxygen cage in the corner, eyes closed, chest moving. Priya was at the monitor, earbuds in, completely unaware. Kestrel Margin. She hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in 14 months. She had heard it in her own head approximately every 3 days since. She pressed her back flat against the wall beside the door, and she did not close her eyes, because closing them was the one thing she couldn't afford, and she knew that, had always known that. And so she stood there with her eyes open, and the barn cat breathing and Priya oblivious, and the name of the thing that had ended her life ringing in the space, behind her sternum like a struck bell. Then she straightened up. She pulled her gloves from her pocket. She walked to the oxygen cage and checked the cat's readings, and she was professional, and she was competent, and she was Dana Reeves, veterinary nurse, and she was fine. She was fine. The second escalation came at 1:58 in the morning, which was when Garrett found Voss in the hallway outside the conference room, and the conversation between them, which was not loud but was also not quiet, reached the nurse's station where Dana was charting. She caught pieces of it. She was supposed to be charting, and she was charting, and she also had hearing that she'd spent years pretending was ordinary. You're not authorized to run a field identification on a civilian without... She's not a civilian, Garrett. That's the entire point. You don't know that, and even if you did, the protocol for a missing personnel case is not to walk into a veterinary clinic. And I didn't walk in here for her. The dog led us here, which is the dog doing what dogs do, and it doesn't give you grounds to. I have the file. The biometric match is 94% on facial geometry. The hallway went quiet. Dana's pen stopped moving. She became aware that she had stopped breathing, which was not useful, and she started again. 94% on facial geometry. That meant Voss hadn't just been cross-referencing employment records. He'd run her photo against a database at some point during the evening intake photo from the facility system, or the camera in the lobby, or Jolene's screen when she'd taken the intake, and he had a number. 94% wasn't confirmation, but it wasn't nothing. She set down her pen. She thought calmly, with the particular quality of calm that was not the absence of fear, but was fear held by a very tight grip about what her options were. She could leave. She'd built the capacity for that into every life she'd made. 3 days of supplies in the truck, documents in the lockbox under the passenger seat, $2,000 in cash in the hidden panel in the wheel well. She could be in the truck in 4 minutes, on the highway in 6, and she could be somewhere that wasn't Harlow Peak by the time the sun came up. She could do that. She looked at the bay window, where Strike's vitals were running on the remote monitor, his heart rate steady, his respiration slow and even. She picked up her pen. She kept charting. She told herself it was because leaving in the middle of a shift was professionally irresponsible, and that she didn't abandon patients. That was true. She also told herself that running now would confirm everything Voss was building toward, and that was true too. She didn't examine the third thing, which was the one that sat lowest and heaviest, and which she was not prepared to look at directly. 2:30, Garrett came to find her again. She was in the supply room, doing a genuine inventory that needed doing, because tasks that needed doing were anchors, and she needed something to hold on to right now. He stood in the doorway, and she kept counting gauze rolls, and he let her for a minute before he spoke. Voss is going to request a formal identity verification in the morning, he said. He'll need to go through channels to do it. Takes about 6 hours. He'll have to call his supervisor, who will need to call someone above that, and so on. He paused. You have tonight. Dana set down the gauze roll. She turned around. Why are you telling me that? She asked. He looked at the middle distance for a second, like he was working through something. Because if you're who he thinks you are, and I'm not saying you are, I'm saying if, then what happened to your unit is something that matters. And the way things go when people like Voss get a hold of a missing personnel case, the narrative doesn't always. He stopped. Started again. Evidence has a way of becoming whatever the debrief needs it to become. You know that. She was very still. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Yeah. He looked at her steadily. You said that. He moved back toward the door. Strike is asking for you. He won't settle for me. And he won't let Voss anywhere near the bay. Figured you should know. He left. Dana stood between the shelves for a long time. Long enough that Priya came looking for her and seemed genuinely confused to find her standing motionless in the supply room, staring at a shelf of bandaging material. You okay? Fine. Sorry. Long night. You're telling me. Priya grabbed what she'd come for and left. Dana went back to the bay. Strike was awake, properly awake this time, sedation mostly cleared. He lifted his head when she came in, and the movement pulled at his suture line, and he made a sound of discomfort and then looked at her like it was her fault, which was exactly what a dog did when it was awake enough to be irritated, and she found herself almost smiling at that. Don't move like that, she said. You're going to pull the stitches. He looked at her. He did not look apologetic. She sat down on the stool. She checked his wound. The suture line was intact. No bleeding. Good color on the tissue. His eyes tracked her hands with the focused intensity he'd had since he first came in, and she worked methodically and didn't talk much. And the room was quiet and almost calm. Almost. Because what she hadn't told Garrett, what she hadn't told Voss, what she hadn't told anyone in 5 years, was that the thing Voss was building toward wasn't just a missing personnel case. It wasn't just a biometric match or an employment record with a gap in it or a dog that recognized someone he shouldn't have remembered. Kestrel Margin had produced something, an extraction. Not a person, a drive, a small encrypted hard drive that a dead officer had given her in the last 40 seconds before the operation went sideways, pressed into her hand with blood on his fingers, and 3 words, "Don't let them." She had not let them. She had carried it for 14 months. Through 3 moves, 2 identities, and 1 very carefully constructed life in a mid-sized city with a good animal hospital and people who didn't ask too many questions. It was in the lockbox under the passenger seat of her truck, right next to the documents and the cash. She looked at Strike. Strike looked back at her. Outside in the parking lot, she heard the sound of a new vehicle arriving, not the black SUVs from earlier. Different engine signature, different weight on the asphalt, and the specific silence from the lobby that meant Garrett and his operators had heard it, too, and were already on their feet. Dana stood up. She moved to the bay window and looked out at the parking lot through the narrow gap in the blinds. 3 vehicles, dark-colored, no markings, different than the ones Garrett had arrived in. Different plates. The man who got out of the lead vehicle was not government issue in the way Voss was government issue. He was something else. He scanned the building with the flat efficiency of someone who had already decided what he was here for, and was only confirming the address. Then he looked directly at the window where she was standing. She stepped back before she could process the decision to step back before thought, before choice. Pure reflex from a part of her that had stayed very much alive, even while the rest of her had been building a quiet veterinary life in a mid-sized city in the mountains. She heard Garrett's voice from the lobby, clipped and sharp. "Those aren't ours." And then, from one of the other operators, nobody called for backup. The lights in the parking lot caught the lead man's face as he turned to say something to the driver behind him, and Dana saw clearly, in 1 second of very good visibility, that she recognized him. From Harlow Peak, not from Montana, not from anything that belonged to Dana Reeves. From a room in a building that no longer officially existed. 3 days before an operation called Kestrel Margin went wrong in every direction at once. Pressed her back against the wall. Strike was on his feet. He shouldn't have been suture line, 48 hours minimum, but he was standing on the table with his legs braced, and his attention locked on the window, and a sound in his chest that she felt more than heard, low and continuous and absolutely certain, the sound of an animal that knew exactly what kind of danger had just arrived. "Get down," she said it quietly, to Strike, and the dog obeyed, lowered himself back to the table, with the stiff, careful movement of an animal that hurt and knew it, and did what it was told anyway. Kept one hand on his shoulder. With the other, she pulled the blinds fully closed. Then she moved, not running. Running in a building with injured animals and unprepared civilians created noise and panic, and both of those created problems. She moved the way she'd been trained to move in environments where speed and visibility were a trade-off, fast enough to matter, controlled enough not to announce herself. She came out of the bay and nearly walked into Garrett. He had his hand up, already stop, and she stopped. "You see them?" he asked. 3 vehicles, no markings. The lead man, gray jacket, about 6 feet, close-cropped hair. "Do you know him?" Garrett's jaw tightened. "No, I do," she said, a silence that lasted exactly 1 second, which was all either of them could afford. "From where?" he asked. "From somewhere I'm not supposed to have been." She looked past him toward the lobby, where his 2 operators were positioned, one at the entrance, one beside the front desk, both with the specific stillness of people who had already made their assessments and were waiting for someone to make a decision. "How many rounds do you have between your team?" Garrett stared at her. "How many?" she repeated. This is a civilian facility. We can't." "I know what it is." "How many rounds?" He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man rapidly recalibrating. "Between the 3 of us, standard carry. We weren't running a combat load." "Okay." She looked at the lobby entrance. The glass doors were still closed. Parking lot lights showed the 3 vehicles parked in a loose triangle formation, blocking the main exit, which was deliberate. There's a service entrance in the back, behind the surgical suite. It exits onto the access road that connects to the north side of the lot, outside their perimeter, if they set one. She paused. Comms up? We have satellite relay. Can you reach your CO directly? Yes. Then you need to do that right now, she said. Right now. Not in a minute. Right now. Garrett was already moving toward his operator at the front desk. Dana went back into the bay, not because she'd forgotten about Strike, but because the bay had a window at a different angle than the lobby, and she needed to see where the men from the parking lot were positioned before anyone made a move toward anything. Pressed herself against the wall beside the window and angled to look out. Two of them were at the vehicles. The third gray jacket, the one she recognized, was walking toward the entrance with his hands in his pockets and his pace completely unhurried, like a man who had never been told no and saw no reason to expect it now. His name was Halford. She had not known it at the time during Kestrel Margin. She'd known him only as the man in the room who had not been wearing a uniform, which was the detail that had registered, because everyone else in that room had been wearing something with rank insignia on it. He'd sat at the table during the pre-op briefing and said almost nothing. The unit commander had deferred to him in a way that didn't match the room's official chain of command. 3 days later, the operation went sideways. Her team went in on the extraction and found not the person they'd been told to extract, but a processing facility for documents that were not supposed to exist and what the dead officer had pressed into her. Hand in those last 40 seconds was not intelligence. It was accountability. It was names. She had known, even then, that the names on that air drive were why her team had been sent in without proper support. It was cleaner that way. No witnesses who hadn't already been vetted. She had survived because she was supposed to have been in the medical staging area at the moment the extraction went active, which put her 200 meters away from the kill zone when it collapsed. She had survived because she made a decision in the following 30 seconds that she had never fully examined, not because she didn't understand it, but because she understood it too well, and there was nowhere to put that. Understanding that didn't eventually break something. She had run, not without reason, not without the drive and the names, and the full clarity of what would happen to her if she went back through official channels. She had run because she was the only person left who knew what Kestrel Margin had actually been. And the only way the names on that drive ever saw daylight was if she stayed alive long and enough to deliver them to someone who wasn't already compromised. 14 months later, she still didn't know who that was. Halford was at the entrance now. She heard the front door open. Jolene's voice carried from the lobby. I'm sorry. We're in the middle of an emergency visiting hours are. I'm not here for visiting hours. Halford's voice. Smooth. Practiced patience. I need to speak with the facility administrator. It's 3 a.m. We don't have an administrator on. Then whoever's in charge of the building. Dana moved out of the bay and down the side corridor, the one that ran parallel to the lobby and connected the treatment area to the surgical suite. She went quickly and quietly and kept low up past the interior window that looked into the lobby, because the angle from the lobby desk would put her in peripheral view if she was upright. She made it to the junction and stopped. Garrett was already there, back to the wall, his operator a compact man with a shaved head, who had not introduced himself to anyone and showed no inclination to start now on the opposite side. Garrett had his phone to his ear. His expression said the call was happening and was not producing fast results. Crouched beside him. He's inside, she said, very low. Garrett nodded. Into the phone, I need command authority in the next 3 minutes, or this situation is going to move without it. A pause. He listened. I understand that, sir. But another pause, longer. Jaw worked. Copy. He lowered the phone. CO is trying to reach someone above him, he said. This doesn't fall under our operational mandate. What does your operational mandate cover? We're asset transport. We were moving Strike to the nearest qualified facility. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was seeing a map he hadn't been given. We are not a combat team tonight. The men in that parking lot are. You don't know that. Halford spent 11 years running termination operations for a black budget program that officially doesn't exist, she said, keeping her voice level. I know that because I sat in a room 14 months ago and listened to a dead man tell me what he'd found before they shot him. So yes. She looked at Garrett. I know that. The silence between them had a different quality now. His operator, the compact one, with the shaved head, looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Dana. How much of this connects to why you disappeared? He asked. All of it. And the dog? She almost said, what about the dog? but she knew what he was actually asking. He was asking whether Strike's recognition of her was incidental, or whether it was the thing that had led Halford here tonight. Whether someone had tracked the team's movement to this facility and cross-referenced the staff, whether the dog's reaction to her had been logged somewhere or flagged on a network she didn't know about. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But Halford being here and Voss being here on the same night with Strike is not a coincidence. Someone connected those pieces before we did." Voss, Garrett's voice went flat. "Is Voss? I don't know whose side Voss is on. I don't know if he has sides. He might just be the mechanism and not the hand." She looked toward the lobby junction. "But Halford is the hand." From the lobby, Halford's voice again. "Still patient. Still easy. I just need a few minutes. There's nothing to be concerned about." Jolene and Dana's chest did something involuntary at this, because Jolene was a 31-year-old receptionist with a plant collection and a cat, and absolutely no part in any of this. Jolene said, with a steadiness she absolutely should not have had to find at 3 in the morning. "Sir, I need you to wait in the lobby. I'm going to call the administrator now." "Of course," Halford said. "A beat. Take your time." The surgical suite had 2 exits, one into the main treatment corridor, one through a utility closet that connected to the service hallway, and, ultimately, to the back entrance. Dana knew the building's layout, the way she knew any building she'd worked in, long enough not through deliberate study, but through the accumulated habit of someone who had never fully stopped noting exits. She moved through the utility closet alone, because there was no time to coordinate, and because the thing she needed to do required only herself in 30 seconds, and the specific dexterity that had not, despite 3 years of veterinary nursing, left her fingers. The utility closet had a junction box on the rear wall. She opened it. The building's camera system ran on a secondary power feed that was separate from the main electrical she'd established that 8 months ago, when she helped the maintenance guy troubleshoot a display issue in the waiting room. She pulled the secondary relay. The feed died. Everything Halford's people might have been using to track movement inside the building was now running blind. Put the relay cover back. She moved to the back entrance and checked the door locked. Security bar engaged. She left it locked. If she needed it open, she could open it in under 6 seconds. Right now, she needed it closed. She went back through the suite into the treatment corridor and nearly collided with Marcus, who had appeared from somewhere looking rumpled and confused and fundamentally unprepared for the environment he'd walked into. "What the hell is going on?" he said. "There are people in the lobby who—" "Go to your office and lock the door," Dana said. "Excuse me?" "Marcus." She stopped and looked at him directly. "I am not asking you to trust me, and I am not explaining the situation. I am telling you that the safest place for you right now is your office, with the door locked. Do you understand?" He blinked at her. "You're a nurse," he said, as if this settled something. "I'm a lot of things," she said. "Go," he went. She didn't watch him go because she didn't have time, and she moved back to Garrett's position to find that the compact operator she had started thinking of him as shaved head because it was faster, had repositioned to the lobby-adjacent corridor, and the third operator, a woman named Torres, who Dana had barely registered when the team arrived because Torres had a gift for occupying space without drawing attention, had appeared from somewhere and was now visible at the far end of the treatment hallway. Torres had very calm eyes and was carrying something under her jacket that she hadn't been carrying visibly when they came in, which answered the question of whether the team's loadout was truly as light as Garrett had implied. Dana filed that away without comment. "How many in the lobby?" she asked Garrett. "1. Halford. His other 2 stayed outside. He's alone because he doesn't think he needs more than 1 person for this," she said. "Confidence or contempt. Given who he is, probably both." "Can you get to your vehicle?" Garrett asked. She looked at him. "There's something in my vehicle," she said carefully. "That is the reason all of this is happening." Another recalibration. She could watch it move through his face, the pieces landing in sequence, the picture assembling. He was smart and he was quick, and he didn't try to process us out loud, which she respected. "The drive," he said. She said, "Nothing." "The dead officer gave you a drive," Garrett said. "It wasn't a question. That's why you ran. Not just because of the operation, because you had something." "If I didn't have it," she said quietly, "the people on that drive would never be accountable for anything. They're too well protected. Every official channel runs through someone they own." She looked at him steadily. "The only reason I stayed in one place long enough to build a life is because I was trying to figure out who was clean enough to give it to." "And?" She almost said, "I haven't figured it out yet." Instead, she said, "It's taking longer than I expected." Garrett held her gaze for a long moment. His jaw was tight. She could see him working through a calculation that was probably not simple. His operational mandate said one thing, his instinct said another. And the woman in front of him was asking him, without asking, put his team into a situation that none of them had been briefed for. "What do you need?" he said. "Time," she said. "And someone to watch the back entrance while I get to my truck. Can't authorize a tactical operation in a civilian's." "I'm not asking for a tactical operation. I'm asking you to stand in a hallway." She held his gaze. "You're good at standing in hallways. I've watched you do it for 4 hours." Shaved head made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then was not a laugh. Garrett exhaled through his nose. "Torres," he said. Torres came down the hall. "Back entrance," Garrett said. "Nothing gets through." Torres nodded once and moved. Dana went to the bay first, because that was the order of operations and she knew it, even if part of her wanted to move directly to the truck. Strike was standing again. "I told you," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a dog who had heard and did not particularly care. His suture line was intact. She checked it with her hands, quickly, because touch was faster than visual in low light, and the bay was dimmer with the cameras down. Tissue felt warm but not hot. No seepage. The stitching was holding. "You have to stay still," she said. Strike pressed his head against her sternum. She stood there for 1 second. Just one. Her hand came up and rested on the back of his skull the way it had when he'd first come in, automatic, not calculated, the kind of gesture that bypassed whatever decision-making apparatus she normally kept in front of everything. Then she stepped back. "I'll be back," she said. "Stay." She went out the bay door and down the service corridor to the back entrance, where Torres was positioned with the particular quality of stillness that very good operators had, not rigid, not tense, but available, ready without being wounded. Dana unbarred the door. The service alley behind the building was narrow and poorly lit, one overhead fixture at the far end, the rest in shadow. Her truck was in the staff lot off the building's north side, which meant going left at the end of the alley, along the wall, staying below the sightline of the front parking lot. The rain had dropped to a fine mist. The asphalt was black and wet and reflected the one functioning light in long orange smears. She moved along the wall. Her truck was third from the end, a gray four-door that she had chosen because it was unremarkable and mechanically reliable, and because the previous owner had installed a reinforced floor panel under the passenger seat that was not listed on the vehicle history, and which Dana had found during her pre-purchase inspection and recognized for what it was. She got in the driver's side, low, moved across the console to the passenger side in the dark. Her hands found the panel release by feel. She had done this maybe 200 times in practice, not obsessively, just consistently, the way she maintained any capability she might need. Panel came up. The lockbox was there. She got the drive out. It was smaller than people imagined. When she thought about telling someone about it, a standard encrypted thumb drive in a waterproof case, the kind that contained nothing special to look at, the kind you'd find in a junk drawer and think nothing of. She put it in the inner breast pocket of her scrub top, against her sternum, started to move back across the console. The passenger window shattered, not from a bullet, from the butt of something heavy, applied very fast, and she was already rolling toward the driver's side door before the glass finished falling, because the roll was reflex, and reflex was faster than thought. She got the driver's door open and hit the asphalt on her left shoulder and came up moving, and the man who'd come around the truck's front end, one of Halford's two from the parking lot, she registered. Not Halford himself was already tracking her. He was bigger than her. That was true. He was also expecting a veterinary nurse. What he got was something that had spent 4 years learning how to make those two facts irrelevant. And the next 11 seconds were not clean or cinematic. They were fast and ugly and ended with him face down on the wet asphalt, with his arm at an angle that would require medical attention, which was ironic, and Dana on her feet with her heart hitting her ribs at approximately twice the rate she'd prefer. She breathed. She checked her pocket. Drive still there. She moved back toward the building. She was halfway down the service alley when the building's front entrance, not the back, the front erupted with voices, and she heard Garrett's voice at a volume and register he hadn't used before, and then a sound that was not a weapon being fired, but was a confrontation crossing a threshold, and then Jolene, loud and frightened, "Get your hands off him," and then Everything went quiet in a way that was worse than the noise. Dana broke into a run. She came through the back entrance past Torres, who had heard it too, and was already in motion down the service corridor, through the treatment bay junction, and into the lobby in time to see Garrett with his hands raised, and his two operators in the same position, and Halford standing in the center of the room with Voss beside him, which confirmed what she'd suspected about Voss, or at least complicated it badly, and two of Halford's men at the entrance with their weapons up, and Jolinzi against the far wall, with her hands shaking and her face white. Halford looked at Dana. He had the specific expression of a man who had been doing a job for a long time and was tired and would prefer to finish it and go home. "Ms. Reeves," he said, "or whatever you'd like to be called." She stopped in the middle of the room. She made herself stand still, made herself breathe at a normal rate, made herself look at the room with the clinical assessment of someone trained for high-pressure environments instead of the pounding animal panic that was running underneath all of it. Garrett and his operators were unarmed weapons on the floor, hands visible. Halford's two men at the door. Voss off to the right, and his face was doing something she hadn't expected, which was that he did not look satisfied. He looked like a man who had gotten somewhere he didn't intend to go and was trying to figure out how he'd arrived. She filed that. "I'd like everyone to stay calm," Halford said, in the voice of someone who was not particularly concerned about what people would like. "This is a records recovery situation. Nothing more." He looked at Dana. "You have something that belongs to us. You return it, and everyone goes home. Simple, belongs to you," she said. "To the program, yes, which you accessed without authorization and removed from a classified site during an active operation." He was very reasonable about it. That was the part that was hardest to stand still through the reasonableness. "We're not interested in prosecution. We're interested in the material. Because of what's on it," she said. "Because it's classified property. Because of the names on it," she said. The room was very still. "Names of a lot of people," she continued. "People who authorized Kestrel Margin, knowing that the team going in wasn't expected to come out. Who signed off on the facility and what it was doing, and what happened to the people who found out about it before my team did." She looked at Halford steadily. "Your name is on it." The reasonableness in his face didn't disappear. Something underneath it shifted. "Give me the drive," he said, "and we're done here." "You're done here either way," she said. "Dana." Garrett's voice, careful, from across the room. "Whatever you're thinking, I made copies," she said. Halford went still. "Before I came to Harlow Peak," she continued. 3 copies. 3 different locations. 3 different people who don't know each other and don't know me and have instructions that trigger if they don't receive a specific contact from me every 90 days. She had been building this for over a year, and she had never said it out loud to anyone, and the strange thing was that saying it out loud now, in a lobby with weapons pointed at people she'd worked with for 3 years, felt less like a threat and more like the first true thing she'd said in a very long time. "Kill me, you get the drive, and in 90 days 3 separate packages go to 3 separate journalists and a federal oversight committee that you don't own." She paused. "Checked. You don't own them." Halford looked at her. She looked back. The 2 operators at the door were watching their boss. Voss was watching Dana. His expression had changed into something she couldn't fully read, something that sat between alarm and the particular focused attention of a person who has just understood a situation correctly for the first time. He reached into his jacket. Everyone in the room tensed, including Halford's men. Voss pulled out his phone. He looked at Halford. "The operational mandate for this recovery," Voss said, and his voice had a different quality now, stripped of the pleasant professional distance. Just flat and direct, was authorized under a provision that requires active threat classification. He held Halford's gaze. "She's unarmed, in a civilian medical facility, with 3 witnesses," he paused. "This is not a recoverable position." Halford looked at Voss with the expression of a man reconsidering an alliance. "Put it down, Aldrin," he said. "Quiet, certain." "No," said Voss. And he dialed. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Voss didn't say his name. He said a string of numbers, 12 digits, delivered without pause, from memory, and then he said, "I need a secure line to the Inspector General's office. Priority channel. Right now." He turned slightly away from Halford, which was not as protective a position as it looked, but which communicated something specific about how he was choosing to stand in the room. Halford watched him the way a man watches a structural beam he's just realized is load-bearing. The 2 operators at the entrance were looking at each other. Small movements eyes, nothing more the kind of communication people developed when they worked together long enough. Dana read it the way she'd always read those exchanges, which was as a calculation in progress. They were armed, and their orders came from Halford, and the situation had just introduced a variable their orders hadn't accounted for. Garrett's hands were still raised. He had not moved. But he was watching her, not Halford, and that told her something about where he thought the room's center of gravity actually was. Aldrin. Halford's voice dropped into something harder than the reasonable tone he'd been using. Think about what you're doing. I've been thinking about it for 6 months, Voss said. Into the phone now, giving the string of numbers again, for someone new. Thinking is done. Halford moved, not toward Voss, toward Dana, one step smooth and fast, and his hand came out from his jacket with a compact device that was not a weapon in the conventional sense, but that she recognized as a signal jammer, broad spectrum, the kind that could take out a phone call, a satellite relay, and a camera system in a 100-meter radius simultaneously. She was already moving when he raised it. She went for him, not around him, not away from him, directly at him, closing the distance in the 2 seconds before he got the jammer oriented, because at close range a jammer was a box, and she was a person, and people beat boxes. She hit his arm on the upswing with her forearm, not a clean block but enough to redirect, and the jammer went wide and activated. Anyway, she heard the electronic scream of it, but the phone call Voss was on had already gone through. Whether it had gone through far enough was a question that the next 20 minutes would answer. Halford recovered faster than she expected. He was in his 50s, and he was not a field operator, but he'd stayed in good shape, and he had the advantage of genuinely not caring what happened to her, which was a specific kind of focus she was familiar with from the other side. He grabbed her wrist. She broke the grip, 2-step, rotate, pull but not cleanly. She took a hit across the shoulder that spun her half around before she got her feet under her again. The room exploded into motion. Garrett was moving before his hands were fully down. Shaved Head went for the nearest of Halford's men at the entrance. Torres came in from the service corridor behind Halford, and the second entrance operator simultaneously, which was coordinated in a way that said Torres and Shaved Head had used the pause in the lobby to do something that looked like standing still and was actually planning. Jolene from the corner. Oh my, and then a crash as she put herself behind the front desk, which was the correct move, and she found it without being told, which Dana filed as something to acknowledge later. The jammer was on the floor. Dana went for it. She got stepped on Halford's foot, whether deliberate or not, and her hand closed on the device, but she couldn't get purchase on the floor with her left side. And she was about to get stepped on again when Strike appeared. He came through the bay door on 3 legs, the fourth held carefully off the ground, moving with the focused intent of an animal that had made a decision and was executing it. He didn't attack. He placed himself between Dana and Halford, dropped his head, and made the sound she'd heard before, low and continuous and entirely certain. Halford stopped, not because the dog scared him, because the dog was injured and recovering from surgery, and standing between him and his objective and the calculation of what it would take to get past the dog was one that even Halford, who was not squeamish, made in a fraction of a second and then made differently. Dana got the jammer off the floor. She pulled the battery pack from the rear housing 6 seconds, her fingers finding the release panel by the same mechanism. Her hands found the lockbox in her truck by repetition, by the kind of memory that lived in the body rather than the brain. The device died. The lobby was loud, 2 separate physical confrontations. Torres's voice cutting through it all, with a controlled sharpness that indicated she had her situation managed even if it didn't sound like it. Garrett somewhere behind her, dealing with Halford, now that Dana had cleared the space. She stood up. She pulled out her phone. She dialed the number she had memorized 14 months ago and never used, the one she'd been given by the dead officer in the last 40 seconds before Kestrel Margin collapsed. The one she'd verified was still active every 3 months, by calling it from a burner and hanging up after 2 rings. Picked up on the first ring. "This is Dr. Mercer Wyland," said the voice. Not groggy, already awake, which meant either she'd gotten him at a strange hour of his schedule, or he'd been expecting a call that might sound something like this. "Who am I speaking with?" "A name you were given 14 months ago," she said, along with instructions. A silence. "Yes," he said. "I need you to activate those instructions," she said. "Tonight." The next 45 minutes were the strangest of Dana's recent life, which had contained a reasonable number of strange moments. She stood in the lobby of Harlow Peak Veterinary Trauma Center at 3:40 in the morning with a recovering military working dog sitting on her left foot. He had decided this was where he was going to be, and she had stopped arguing, and she watched the room reorganize itself around a series of phone calls and decisions that she was no longer the only one making. Voss's call had gone through. Enough of it, anyway. He'd reached a deputy in an oversight office, whose jurisdiction technically covered the program Halford ran, and what he'd managed to say in the seconds before the jammer activated was apparently sufficient to generate paperwork, because 20 minutes after Dana hung up with Weiland, 2 federal vehicles arrived in the parking lot, not the dark unmarked kind, but the kind with visible markings, which was the visible kind, which was the point. Halford's 2 operators at the entrance had already made their calculation by then. They'd set their weapons down during the melee, a careful, deliberate decision, she thought, rather than a forced one, and were sitting against the far wall with the specific body language of people who had decided that the job they'd been given was not the job they'd signed up for. Nobody had restrained them. Nobody needed to. Garrett had Halford in a seated position near the window, with his hands zip-tied, using a set that Torres produced from somewhere on her person. Torres apparently carried several things that weren't immediately visible, which Dana was updating her assessment of Torres around, and Halford was not talking. He was looking at the middle distance with the compressed fury of a man who has run a controlled environment for years and has just watched the variables refuse to be controlled. He didn't look at Dana. She understood that. Looking at her would require acknowledging that she was the reason the room had turned, and that was not something his particular kind of pride could navigate gracefully. She sat on the reception desk because her left shoulder where he'd hit her was aching in the deep way that indicated bruising rather than structural damage, and she pressed her thumb into the muscle and breathed through it while she watched the federal agents come through the door and begin the specific choreography of an organized intervention, identifying themselves, curing the room in the official sense, beginning the documentation that would eventually become the official record of tonight. Voss was talking to the lead agent. His voice was steady, and his language was precise and professional, and watching him, Dana revised her understanding of who he was and what tonight had actually been for him. He hadn't arrived knowing what he'd find. He'd arrived following a lead, the biometric match, the employment gap, and somewhere in the process of building toward Halford's objective. He'd crossed a line he hadn't intended to cross, and realized he wasn't going to uncross it quietly. He was not her ally. He was also not her enemy. He was a man who had found himself in a room he didn't recognize and made a choice about how to leave it. She could work with that. The lead agent, a woman, 50-ish, with a silver lanyard, and the kind of calm that came from having managed many rooms in distress, looked at Dana across the lobby. She didn't come over yet. She finished her conversation with Voss and made a note, and then she came over. Stopped. "What name would you like me to use?" Dana looked at her for a moment. "Reeves is fine for now," she said. The agent nodded. "I'm Special Agent Doris Pratt. I understand you have material relevant to a classified program." Dana reached into her breast pocket and produced the drive. She held it for a moment, just a moment, between her fingers. 14 months of carrying weight so specific she'd stopped feeling it. The way you stopped feeling a ring you'd worn long enough. The way you stopped feeling a lot of things you carried long enough. She handed it over. "There are 3 copies," she said. "I'll provide the locations once I have confirmation that a full independent investigation has been opened. Not departmental review independent. And the names on that drive are the scope of the investigation, not the starting point for a negotiation about scope." Pratt took the drive. She looked at it. She looked at Dana. "You've been holding on to this for 14 months, she said. "Longer than I wanted to," Dana said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't know if the people I'd give it to were already in it," Dana said. "I needed to be sure." Pratt seemed to find this reasonable rather than paranoid, which was itself something Dana noted. "And now you're sure?" "Weiland vouched for you," Dana said. "Closest I get to sure." Pratt pocketed the drive. "We're going to need a full debrief. Tonight, if possible." "I know it's late," Dana said. "I know. There'll be a medical evaluation as well. Standard for returned personnel." Dana looked at her. "I'm not returned personnel. I'm a veterinary nurse." Pratt held her gaze and said nothing, which was a form of saying something, and Dana let it land. Strike shifted on her foot. She looked down at him. His suture line was in her peripheral concern, every 30 seconds a rhythm she'd established automatically. And he was holding his weight correctly, left flank elevated, the leg he'd been using to guard the wound, doing its job without making his discomfort look like anything other than a dog choosing where to sit. She was going to have to get him back on the table. She would do that after. The debrief room was the conference room that Jolene had set up for Garrett's team 4 hours earlier, which was still strewn with coffee cups and the specific debris of people who had been awake too long and didn't expect to stay. Pratt pulled a chair to one side of the table. Her partner, a younger agent named Co, who had said almost nothing since arriving and wrote everything down with mechanical efficiency, sat to her left. Dana sat across from them. She had refused the offer of a different location. She'd asked for water and gotten it. She'd asked that someone check on strike every 15 minutes and been told that Garrett would do it, which she found acceptable. She started talking at 4:10 in the morning. She told it straight through, without embellishment, in the flat, direct language of a person giving a situation report rather than a story. Pre-op briefing where Halford had sat at the table. The mission parameters they'd been given versus the facility they'd found. Processing operation for records that shouldn't have existed, names of program participants. Authorization chains, payments routed through cleared contractors, documentation of decisions that had been made at levels high enough that the paperwork alone, if it surfaced, would constitute evidence of crimes committed across multiple administrations. She told them about the dead officer. She gave his name, Captain Ridley Farnes, and she said it clearly and without flinching because she owed him that at minimum. She described the drive passing from his hand to hers. She described the decision she had made in the following 30 seconds. She did not describe it as heroic. She described it as the only thing that made sense, given what she was holding, and what it would mean if she handed it to the wrong person. Pratt listened. CO wrote. At 4:52, Pratt looked up from her own notes. Personnel records from Kestrel Margin, she said. Your unit's casualty report listed you as missing. Not Kaye missing. Yes. That was deliberate? I was the only one who got out. The report would have said Kaya if there were no body. Dana paused. Missing was more useful to whoever wrote it. It kept the file open. It meant I couldn't have a formal declaration of death that might trigger a review of the circumstances. Pratt made a note. And in 14 months, no contact from any official channel, no missing persons follow-up, no casualty notification inquiry. Nothing. Dana looked at her steadily. The unit was unofficial. The operation was unofficial. Officially, Kestrel Margin was a logistics coordination exercise. She paused. Nobody comes looking for people who were never officially there. The room absorbed that. CO's pen had stopped moving. Dana noticed and said nothing. The copies, Pratt said after a moment. 3 locations. Dana wrote them down on the notepad. CO pushed across the table. She wrote clearly and completely the names of the 3 people holding them, the trigger conditions, the authentication protocols. She handed the notepad back. They'll need to be contacted before the 90-day window, she said. They don't know what they're holding. They were told it was documentation related to a real estate transaction. The contact schedule breaks. They send it. That CO started. Effective, Pratt said, which was not what CO had been going to say, but which was accurate. The door to the conference room opened. Garrett leaned in. His face said something that wasn't simple. Halford's requesting a lawyer, he said, which is fine. He's also his people found something in the parking lot. He looked at Dana. The man from the lot. The one you left face down. He was breathing when I left him, she said. He's fine, Garrett said. But when they ran his ID, he paused, and she could see him choosing his words, which meant the next sentence was going to be significant. He's not connected to Halford's program. Dana went still. His credentials come back to a separate division, Garrett said. One that isn't connected to anything in the Kestrel Margin file. Pratt's head came up. Which division? She asked. Garrett looked at her. That's what we're trying to figure out. Dana's mind ran the geometry of it in the silence that followed fast. The way she'd always been able to do geometry under pressure, map the angles, find the inconsistency, follow it to its source. She thought about the 3 vehicles in the parking lot. She thought about the different plate formats she'd noted. She thought about the fact that Halford had come in alone and left his people outside, which she'd read as confidence, and which now looked like something else. He hadn't known they were there either. Halford didn't send the man in the lot, she said. It wasn't a question. Pratt looked at her. Halford came here to retrieve the drive, Dana said, working it through as she said it. But someone else came here, knowing the drive would be here, knowing Halford would be here. She looked at Pratt steadily. Someone who wanted both. The room was very quiet. Both, Pratt repeated. The drive and Halford, Dana said. The drive as evidence, and Halford as the evidence of who else is in the chain. Not just the names that are already on the file, the names that connect upward from those names. She paused. Someone is building a bigger case than I built. Or they're building a case against you, CO said, not unkindly, but directly, that uses Halford to frame what you carried out as something other than what you say it was. Dana looked at him. He was young and he was careful and he was right to say it. Yes, she said. That's the other option. She stood up. I need to know who owns that division, she said to Pratt, before the debrief continues. Because if the man in the parking lot belongs to someone who wants to use this to bury the Kestrel margin case instead of expose it, then everything I've said in the last hour just became leverage for the wrong people. Pratt was already on her phone. Garrett came fully into the room. There's something else, he said. He looked uncomfortable in the way that large, capable men looked uncomfortable when the information they were delivering was the kind that couldn't be solved by being large or capable. While you were in here, Voss made a second call. Before we knew what division the parking lot guy belonged to. He paused. He flagged your location to someone. We don't know who. Conference room had a window. Dana looked at it not because she expected to see anything useful through it, but because she needed a direction that wasn't a person's face for half a second. It was full dark outside still. 5 a.m. and the mountain dark was still total. The rain down to nothing. The parking lot visible in the pale wash of the facility's exterior lights. 2 additional vehicles had arrived while she'd been talking. She hadn't heard them come in. They were parked at the far edge of the lot, beyond the federal vehicles, beyond Halford's SUVs, dark-colored. Still, she could not see if anyone was in them from this angle and this distance. She turned back to the room. Where's Voss? She asked. Garrett's expression confirmed it before he spoke. We don't know, he said. She absorbed that. The drive, she said to Pratt. The one I gave you. Pratt put her hand to her jacket pocket. Her expression changed. Dana watched it happen, the specific look of a person whose hand has found a pocket that should not be empty and is. It was there 20 minutes ago, Pratt said, and her voice stayed professional, but something underneath it had gone cold. I haven't left this room. Dana looked at the door. The door that Garrett had opened. The door that had been open long enough for someone to cross the distance from the hallway to the table and back, if that someone had moved very fast and very quietly and had known exactly where to put their hand. She thought about Voss's particular quality of moving through spaces like he already owned them. Thought about the call he'd made that had brought the federal vehicles, a call that had also functionally announced to everyone monitoring official channels exactly where she was and what she had. She thought about the second call. She thought about 19 years. She had said she didn't know whose side Voss was on. She had said he might just be the mechanism and not the hand. She looked at Pratt. He was in the hallway outside this room for 3 minutes before Garrett came in, Pratt said. Understanding it at the same moment Dana did. Yes, Dana said. The vehicles at the edge of the parking lot had not moved. CO was already on his radio, calling it in, his voice tight and controlled. Garrett had his phone out. The room had the quality of a situation that had just revealed itself to be larger than the boundary anyone had drawn around it, and the specific horror of that, not dramatic, just the flat cold weight of realizing the map was wrong, settled over everything. Dana stood in it. She had spent 14 months being careful. She had built 3 copies because 1 copy was a single point of failure, and she had learned about single points of failure the hard way. She had created trigger conditions and authentication protocols and a contact list that only she knew completely. She had handed the drive over because Weiland vouched, and Pratt seemed straight, and she had made a judgment call. She had made a judgment call. She breathed. The copies are still out there, she said, as much to herself as to the room. The drive is 1 copy. Losing it doesn't end it. But Voss having it, Garrett started. Voss having it tells us something, she said. It tells us that whoever he's working for needs the original. Not a copy, not the content, the original device. She looked at Pratt. Why would that matter? The content is the same. Pratt's mouth opened slightly. CO looked up from his radio. Chain of custody, CO said. The original goes into the wrong evidence chain. One they control, they can challenge the authenticity of every copy. Without the original as the authenticated source, The copies become contested documents that could take years to verify, Dana finished. The word sat in the room. Years. The kind of years during which people retired. During which memory softened and witnesses became unavailable, and the specific moment of accountability that required a specific alignment of evidence and political will passed and kept passing until it was simply too late to be what it needed to be. Dana picked up her phone. She called Weiland back. He answered on the second ring again. The drive has been taken, she said. I need you to accelerate the copies. Not 90 days tonight. All 3 contacts tonight, with instructions to deliver to the addresses I gave you, encrypted, simultaneously. She paused. Can you do that? A silence. It'll take 4 hours, Weiland said. Maybe 5, then start now, she said. She hung up. Pratt was looking at her with the expression of someone recalibrating and not entirely comfortable with the speed at which the calibration was required. You understand, Pratt said carefully, that if those copies go out before we've established the investigation's framework, with respect, Agent Pratt, Dana said, the investigation's framework is not my primary concern right now. Getting the content in front of people who can't be reached by whatever Voss is connected to is my primary concern. She held Pratt's gaze. If the copies land in the right places tonight, then Voss having the original becomes irrelevant. They can fight chain of custody in court. The court of public record is a different court. Pratt looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Dana. She's right, he said. From outside, somewhere in the parking lot, a car engine turned over. One of the vehicles at the edge of the lot. Moving. Dana crossed to the window fast and looked out in time to see the headlights come on. The car pull forward, and the very specific silhouette of Aldrin Voss visible through the passenger window as the vehicle swung toward the exit. He had the drive. He had a vehicle. And he had, she realized, running the timeline in her head a minimum of 30 minutes before the copy started moving, which was not enough time, but which was what she had. She turned back to the room. I need your car, she said to Garrett. Dana, not to chase him, she said, to get ahead of him. She picked up her phone again, pulling up the map she'd had in her head for 3 years without ever expecting to use it. There's only one road out of the north side of Harlow Peak at this hour that connects to the federal highway. He doesn't know this town. She looked at Garrett. I do. Garrett looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, threw her the keys. She was out the door before Pratt finished saying her name. Strike watched her go from the lobby, standing on 3 legs in the fluorescent light, steady as something anchored. Keys were cold in her hand, and the parking lot was wet, and she got into Garrett's SUV and had it moving before the door was fully closed. She knew the road Voss would take, because there was only one road a person took when they needed to get out of Harlow Peak. Baston didn't know the town. Route 9 North was the obvious choice. The highway was visible from the facility, well lit, easy to navigate. Any outsider would take it. It fed directly onto the federal connector, and from there to the airport in Crestfall 40 minutes out, which was where a man with a drive and a head start would go. The problem with Route 9 North was Millhaven Junction. Dana had driven through Millhaven Junction 600 times in 3 years. She knew that the through road appeared to continue straight, but actually curved left at the rail crossing, and that the right fork unmarked, easy to miss in this dark, was the old quarry access road that came out 2 miles ahead of where Route 9 rejoined the connector. It wasn't a shortcut anyone found by accident. It was a shortcut you found by living somewhere long enough to learn what the maps left out. She took the right fork. The road was rough, and she was pushing the SUV faster than the surface wanted to be pushed, the rear end sliding once on a patch of standing water before the tires caught and held. Kept her foot down. The headlights threw the tree line in sharp shadow, and she drove by memory as much as by sight, counting landmarks she'd accumulated without meaning to the bent guardrail post, the gap in the tree canopy where a power line cut through, the broken reflector on the curve before the quarry gate. Came out onto the connector road in 4 minutes and turned north. She pulled into the shoulder past the junction and killed the headlights. She waited. Her shoulder throbbed. She pressed her thumb into it again, breathed through the discomfort, and watched the road. 90 seconds later, a pair of headlights came up Route 9 and turned onto the connector. She let them pass. Then she pulled out behind them. One vehicle. The same car she'd watched pull out of the parking lot. She stayed 200 meters back and matched their speed, which was fast but not reckless, a person trying to make time. Not a person who thought they were being followed. Voss was confident. She'd known that about him from the first conversation. Confidence was useful until it was a liability, and it had just become a liability. She called Pratt. I'm behind him, she said. Connector Road, heading north. He doesn't know I'm here. We have 2 units coming from Crestfall, Pratt said. 7 minutes out. He'll make the airport in 5, if I don't slow him down. Then slow him down. She thought about how to do that for approximately 3 seconds, and then she turned the headlights back on, high beams, and closed the distance from 200 meters to 50 in one sustained acceleration that the SUV's engine handled with a low, determined roar. Voss saw her. She knew because the car ahead surged immediate, reflexive, the speed jump of someone who'd been watching their mirrors and had just seen what was in them. He was fast. She'd give him that. But he was on an unfamiliar road in a car he hadn't chosen, and she was in a vehicle she'd had 30 seconds to assess and find adequate. On a road she could have driven with her eyes closed. She stayed on him. He tried the left shoulder twice, and she blocked it both times, not aggressively, just present, the SUV's size doing the work. She wasn't trying to run him off the road. She was trying to use up his options before the Crestfall units arrived, which meant keeping him on this stretch of road and keeping his speed variable and his attention divided. He understood what she was doing. She knew that because at the 3-minute mark he stopped trying to accelerate, and slowed down not gradually but sharply, brake lights flaring, and she had a half-second to decide whether to follow or take the shoulder, and she took the shoulder, sliding past him on the right. And as she came level with his window, she saw his face. Controlled, professional, recalculating, not afraid. She respected that even as she pulled ahead and put the SUV sideways across both lanes. She got out. He stopped. The road was empty in both directions. The mountain dark was absolute past the headlights. She stood between the vehicles with her hands visible and the cold mist coming off the asphalt, and she looked at Voss through his windshield and waited. He sat in the car for a long moment. Then he got out. He stood on the other side of his hood, with his hands at his sides, and looked at her. Across the distance between the vehicles, and the expression on his face was the most honest she'd seen from him all night. Pleasant, not professional, not calculating. Just tired. You can't stop this with a truck, he said. I'm not stopping it with a truck, she said. I'm buying 4 minutes. He heard the sirens before she said it. She saw the moment they registered. His chin tilting slightly, the specific attention shift of someone hearing something they'd hoped not to hear. Crestfall units were close. Their lights weren't visible yet, but the sound in the mountain air was carrying further than it would in a city. Give me the drive, Voss, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. You don't know what you're in the middle of, he said. I know exactly what I'm in the middle of, she said. I've been in the middle of it for 14 months. Not this part. He took one step forward and stopped, hands still visible. Nothing threatening in the movement, just closing the distance enough to talk without the wind taking his words. The division that sent the man in your parking lot. They're not trying to bury Kestrel margin. They've been trying to expose it for 2 years. Through channels you can't see because you've been living in a veterinary clinic in the mountains. She kept her expression level. Then they can expose it without the original drive, she said. Copies do the same work. The copies don't have the authentication signatures from the original device, he said. Without those signatures, the opposing legal team spends 18 months challenging provenance, and the whole thing dies in discovery. He held her gaze. You built a redundancy system. So did they. The original device is the pin that the whole system locks around. The sirens were louder. Dana looked at him. The problem with Voss, she'd known it from the break room conversation, from the way he'd phrase things, from the specific quality of his attention, was that he was not stupid, and people who were not stupid were the hardest thing to navigate because they could be wrong in ways that were almost indistinguishable from right. Who do they report to? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. The division, she said. Who's their oversight? Inspector General's office, he said. Specifically the deputy who took my call tonight. Thought about that. Pratt had called the IG's office. Voss had called the IG's office. The same office had dispatched both, which meant either they were on the same side, or the office was large enough to contain people on different sides without knowing it, which was the more likely answer, because institutions were always large enough to contain people on different sides without knowing it. Weiland, she said. Voss blinked. It was the first time she'd surprised him. You know Weiland, she said. He's the one who he stopped. Reassembled. He's the one who's been running the parallel case, Voss said. For 2 years. The reason your dead officer had that drive ready to hand off was because Farnese was working with Weiland before the operation. They both knew what Kestrel Margin actually was. The drive was meant to reach Weiland directly. She stood very still. It didn't reach him because you ran, Voss said. Not accusatory, just the fact of it. You ran and you disappeared, and the parallel case had no source material and no witness, and it stalled. He paused. Until Strike walked into a veterinary clinic and recognized someone who wasn't supposed to exist. The lights from the Crestfall units came around the curve. She had about 30 seconds. She thought about Farnes pressing the drive into her hand, with blood on his fingers. She thought about the 30 seconds after, the decision she'd made, the running she'd done. She'd told herself it was strategic. She'd told herself it was the only way to keep the content alive. She had not told herself the part where running had also broken a chain of 2 years of careful parallel work by people she'd never known were there. That part sat in her chest with the specific weight of something she was going to have to carry for a long time. "Give me your supervisor's direct line," she said. "In the division." He reached into his jacket. She tensed. He produced a card plain, no logo, a handwritten number, and held it out. She crossed to him and took it. Crestfall units came to a stop behind Voss's car with their lights going, and 2 agents got out with their hands on their weapons and started issuing instructions in the clipped, professional tone of people who had been briefed on a vehicle pursuit and were executing accordingly. Dana held up both hands and turned to face them. "I'm the one who called it in," she said. "This man has a piece of evidence that needs to go to the IG's office under verified chain of custody." She looked at the lead agent. "I need you to take possession of it directly and transport it with your body camera, running continuously from this point. Exceptions." The agent looked at her. He was maybe 32, and he hadn't expected whatever this was, but he was professional enough to recover from the unexpected without making it visible for more than a second. "Your name?" he asked. She looked at the road, at the mountains beyond the headlights. Dark that was beginning, very slightly, to thin at its eastern edge, not sunrise yet. But the idea of it, the slow withdrawal of night that happened before any light was actually visible. She took a breath. "Commander Dana Claire Reeves," she said. "Navy Medical Extraction Unit, formerly classified. And I've been trying to get home for a very long time." The formal identification took 11 days. She'd known it would take time, not because the identification itself was complicated, but because the institutional machinery that had marked her missing had to be run in reverse, and machinery ran at its own pace, regardless of urgency. There were records to correct and service files to unseal, and a medical board evaluation that she submitted to, with the particular patience of someone who had been patient for much longer than 11 days. She stayed in Harlow Peak for all of it. She hadn't planned to. She'd assumed she would move, that the cover, once blown, was done, and that staying would be uncomfortable in ways that weren't worth navigating. Pratt's team had set up a temporary field office in Crestfall, and the debrief required proximity. And somewhere in the first week, she looked around at the clinic and the staff and the mountain air and realized that she had no particular place to go that was better than here. So she stayed. She went to work. Marcus was strange with her, for the first 3 days distant, in a way that she recognized as a person reordering their understanding of someone they thought they knew. On the 4th day, he stopped her in the corridor outside Bay 2, said, with the slightly pained directness of a person forcing themselves to say something they didn't naturally say, "You're still the best nurse in this clinic. I want you to know I know that." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "I'm not great at—" He waved a hand. "I know," she said. "I know you're not." He almost smiled. He went back into his bay. Things between them weren't fixed, but they were different, and different in this case was better. Jolene, by contrast, had fully adopted the situation within approximately 24 hours, in the way that certain practical people adopted complicated situations by simply incorporating them into their existing worldview and moving forward. She'd asked 3 specific questions. Was Dana coming back to work? Was she safe? And did she need anything? And upon receiving satisfactory answers to all 3, had gone back to running the front desk with her characteristic efficiency and had told anyone who asked that things at Harlow Peak were fine, which they were. Priya had been largely asleep for the most dramatic hours of the night and had woken to a transformed situation, which she'd processed visibly and out loud over the course of about 48 hours before reaching a state of equilibrium that involved following Dana around for one shift asking questions. after which she seemed satisfied. Strike was the most straightforward of all of them. Stayed. The question of his disposition had apparently generated significant paperwork, since he was technically military property, and his handler was gone, and his unit designation was classified, and nobody in the official chain had clean authority to say what happened to him next. Garrett had made several phone calls. Weiland had apparently made one, which was more efficient. The outcome was that Strike was placed on medical leave, an administrative category that existed for working dogs, and which had the practical effect of requiring him to remain in a qualified medical facility pending recovery, which was Harlow Peak Veterinary Trauma Center, under the care of the staff nurse, which was Dana. The paperwork would take months to resolve, probably. Nobody seemed particularly motivated to rush it. Halford was arrested formally on the 9th day. Not by the Crestfall agents, not by Pratt's team, by a joint federal task force that had apparently been watching the program he ran for longer than anyone had told Dana, which she had complicated feelings about and chose not to express to anyone except Strike, who received them without comment one evening while she was doing his suture check. Charges were extensive. The list included authorization of unauthorized operations, conspiracy to obstruct classified evidence recovery, and this was the one that landed differently, that had a specific gravity. The others didn't quite reach responsibility for the deaths of personnel during operations where support was deliberately withheld. Kestrel Margin was named specifically. Farnes was named specifically. Her unit was named specifically. All four of them herself included listed not as operational casualties, but as victims of a deliberate decision to expose a team to a mission where failure was the intended outcome. She read the charging document alone in the break room at 7 in the morning before the day shift started. She'd been awake since 4. She read it twice, not because the language was unclear, but because she needed it to be real more than once. Needed the specific weight of it, official paper, official language, official acknowledgement, to exist in her hands the way it had existed only in her chest for 14 months. She set it down. She sat with it for a while. She didn't feel what she had imagined she would feel. She had imagined, in the abstract way she'd allowed herself to imagine it, that accountability arriving would feel like relief, a door opening, like some specific constriction loosening. What it felt like, actually, was grief. Not fresh grief. The fresh grief had happened 14 months ago, and she'd carried it every day since. This was the grief that came after, the kind that accountability unlocked rather than resolved, because the people who were named in that document as victims were still gone, and the document naming them didn't change that, and she had known that intellectually, but knowing it intellectually was not the same as sitting in a break room at 7 in the morning, knowing it in the body. She let it be what it was. She gave it the room it needed, without trying to make it into something more manageable. Then she washed her face in the sink, refilled her coffee, and went to check on her patients. Voss appeared at the clinic on the 11th day. He didn't come in past the lobby. He stood at the entrance with his jacket collar up against the morning cold, and Jolene came to find Dana in Bay 1 and said, with the particular look she reserved for situations she found interesting, "There's a man at the front who says he owes you an explanation." Dana dried her hands and went out. He looked like he'd slept less than she had, which was saying something. The gray at his temples was more visible in daylight. He was carrying a flat envelope that he held out when she was close enough. She took it. "The authentication verification came back," he said. "The original drive and the copies the IG's office ruled them admissible as a unified evidentiary package. Provenance challenge is effectively dead." She looked at the envelope. "The case is going forward," he continued. "Full independent prosecution. The names on the drive, every one of them is being reviewed." She opened the envelope. It was a formal letter, government letterhead, dense language that she read the way she read charting documents now twice, for realness. The conclusion was what Voss had said. The evidence would stand. She folded it back into the envelope. "You could have sent this," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "The call you made," she said. "The second one. The one Garrett told me about." He didn't look away. "Yes, you called the division." "Yes. You were trying to get the drive to them before it went into a chain of custody. I wasn't certain. Was clean," he said. "Yes." He paused. "I'd been suspicious of 2 people in Pratt's office for 6 months. I wasn't certain. I needed the drive in secure hands before the question could become material." Thought about that. She thought about Pratt's hand going to her empty pocket. She thought about the 40 seconds in the conference room that she'd spent building a theory and whether that theory had been right or whether it had been almost right, which was a different thing entirely. Pratt? She asked. No, he said. Pratt is clean. It was someone 2 levels above her. He paused. That person has been suspended pending investigation. She nodded slowly. I'm telling you this, he said, with the cadence of a man who had rehearsed how to say something and found that rehearsal inadequate when the moment arrived. Because I spent 4 hours building a case about who you were that I was going to hand to people who would have used it to discredit everything you were carrying. Told myself it was procedure, that it was my job. He stopped. It was my job. But it also would have destroyed the one thing that could hold those people accountable. And I knew that, and I told myself procedure anyway. The morning was cold, and the clinic's exterior light made everything look pale. What changed? She asked. He thought about it. Strike, he said. The way the dog looked at you. He seemed faintly embarrassed by this, which was the most human she'd seen him. I know how that sounds. It doesn't sound as strange as you think, she said. She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and said nothing that words would have made worse. He left. She stood on the clinic steps for a moment with the envelope and the cold mountain air and the specific feeling of something that had been in motion for 14 months, finally coming to rest. Not an ending she understood enough about how these things worked to know that the legal process would take years and would be unglamorous and would require her to give testimony in rooms with bad lighting and speak the names of the dead again in official language until the words lost their original shape. That was ahead of her. All of that was ahead of her. But the carrying the specific aloneness of carrying something no one else could touch, that part was done. The formal reinstatement came on a Thursday in late October, 6 weeks after the night. Garrett's team brought Strike through the emergency bay. It was not a ceremony. She had specifically declined a ceremony, twice firmly enough that the third offer never materialized. What it was in practice was a meeting in a government building in Crestfall with Pratt and 2 people from the IG's office, and a woman from the military personnel division who had a folder with Dana's name on it and who went through the folder with her in a windowless conference room for 2 hours. At the end of it, the woman closed the folder and said, "Your service record has been corrected to reflect the full scope of your deployments, your commendations, and the circumstances of Operation Kestrel Margin. The missing classification has been removed." She paused. "Your rank is formally restored. You are no longer listed as missing." Dana looked at the table. There was a pen on the table that nobody had used. She looked at it instead of the woman's face because she needed somewhere neutral to put her eyes for a second. "Thank you," she said. It came out rougher than she intended. She didn't apologize for that. On her way out of the building, she stopped in the lobby and stood next to a window that looked out at a gray October sky, and she let herself have the feeling, whatever it was, she still wasn't entirely sure. It was too large to have a single name for about 30 seconds. Then she went to her truck and drove back to Harlow Peak. Strike's paperwork resolved on a Monday. Garrett brought it in person, which she hadn't expected. He came through the front door in civilian clothes looking slightly less like a door than usual, handed the folder to Jolene with the specific helplessness of a large, capable man navigating a reception desk, and then found Dana in Bay 1, where she was finishing a post-surgical check on a border collie who had eaten half a garden hose. Stood in the doorway. "The disposition came through," he said. She already knew from his face what the disposition was. "Medical service discharge," he said. "He's non-deployable. Age, the injury." And he paused. They said the primary handler bond was unrecoverable, that it affected his operational reliability. Another pause. Push back on that language. They kept it anyway. She pulled off her gloves. "Where does that put him?" she asked. "Tired status. He needs a qualified handler to sign the care agreement." He held her gaze. "Someone with relevant experience in military working dogs. Someone he's already bonded to." She looked at him for a moment. "Could have mailed that," she said. "I know," he said. "Exactly like Voss." She almost said so. "Is Torres okay?" she asked instead, because Torres had taken a hit in the lobby that she'd never gotten a full report on. Dribs, back on duty last week. "Good, Dana." He shifted his weight. This was the thing he'd actually come to say. "The team CO wants to talk to you. Formally not about Kestrel Margin. That's all routed through the IG's office. About the unit. About what happened. He wants the people who were with you that night to have. He said he wants them to have a name." Garrett stopped. He wants Farnes's name on the right list. The others, too. She was quiet for a moment. The border collie on the table shifted and looked up at her, and she put her hand on its side without looking down. Tell him yes, she said. Garrett nodded once. He left the folder with Jolene on his way out. Dana signed the care agreement that afternoon. There was a particular evening in November, 6 weeks further on, when the clinic was quiet and the mountain dark came early the way it did in that season. And Dana sat on the back step of the building with Strike beside her and a cup of coffee she'd made correctly, for once hot, not forgotten. And she looked at the ridge line above the tree break and thought about almost nothing for a while. Strike leaned against her leg. His suture line had healed clean. The scar would be permanent, a pale line through the brindle coat, but he moved without guarding it now, and he slept without the particular tension that injured animals carried in their bodies. And he had recently begun doing the thing that dogs did when they felt safe in a place, which was act ridiculous with toys, and then look at you to confirm you'd seen. Firmed. Several times. She thought about Farnes, whose name was now on the right list in a government building somewhere, attached to the correct record of what he'd done and why. Thought about the others from her unit names. She hadn't said aloud for 14 months that she'd said in a windowless room until they stopped being just weights and started being something else, something more specific and human and irreducible. She thought about what it cost to carry something alone for a very long time. Not heroically, not the somatic version of carrying, where the burden is visible and impressive. The ordinary version, where you get up and make coffee and go to work, and answers people's questions with the right amount of nothing. And the thing you carry is invisible because you learn to make it invisible. And the invisibility protects the thing, but it also protects you from having to be a person who acknowledges what they're actually holding. She had been very good at that. She was not sure it had been entirely worth the price. There was a version of the last 14 months where she found Wyland sooner, where she trusted someone who deserved it earlier, where the copies went out in the first month and the case moved, and Halford got to a courtroom before he'd had 2 more years to protect himself. She didn't know if that version had been possible. She genuinely didn't know how many of the channels she'd avoided were as compromised as she'd feared, and how many were clean and simply looked suspect from the outside. She might have been right to wait. She might have waited longer than necessary, because the waiting had become, at some point, a habit rather than a strategy. She was uncertain about that. She thought she'd be uncertain about it for a long time, and she was trying to make her peace with uncertainty rather than resolve it into something cleaner than it actually was. Strike looked up at her. She put her hand on his head. The thing that nobody told you about being underestimated consistently, structurally, by people who looked at you and saw only the surface of what you were, was that it did something to your relationship with yourself. Not always the obvious thing. Not always the breaking down thing. Sometimes it did the other thing, the more insidious thing. It made you stop correcting people. Made you accept the frame they put around you, because the frame was useful and functional, and the alternative was being seen, which was its own category of risk. She had used her invisibility. She had used it deliberately and skillfully, and it had kept her alive and kept the drive intact, and kept the evidence moving toward the people who needed it, and she did not regret those outcomes. But she had also, somewhere along the way, let the invisibility become something that felt like all she was. Let the role of the quiet, unremarkable nurse become not a cover, but a self-assessment. And the night Strike walked into the emergency bay and pressed his head against her hand. The thing that had happened in that moment wasn't just recognition, it was the refusal of invisibility. An animal, operating purely on what was real and present and inarguable, had said, "I know what you are. Not what you've been pretending to be. What you are." Couldn't argue with a dog. She'd tried briefly, and it hadn't worked. She finished her coffee. Strike stood up, stretched the elaborate, floor-pressing stretch of a dog making a production of waking from half-sleep, and looked at her with the expectation of someone who knew it was almost time to go inside. "Okay," she said. She stood, her shoulder was fully healed. The bruising had gone through its color progression over 3 weeks and was now indistinguishable from the rest of her, which was how it always went, the body's remarkable, unasked-for insistence on moving forward. She rolled it once, out of habit. It moved clean. She looked at the ridgeline one more time. She had not decided whether to apply for the position that Wyland had mentioned, obliquely, During their fourth phone call, a consulting role with the IG's Oversight Division, working on case support for classified operations reviews. It was not a return to service. It was something else, something that existed in the space between what she'd been and what she was now. Paid less than the clinic, it would require her to sit in those windowless rooms often and speak the names of the dead until the legal system had used them for everything it needed. She would be good at it. She knew that. She had not decided yet. Time. That was the thing she was still adjusting to, the return of time as something that belonged to her rather than something she was surviving inside of. She had 4 weeks before Wyland needed an answer. She had a shift tomorrow morning starting at 6. She had Strike's follow-up appointment to schedule and Priya's birthday on Friday and a loose hinge on Bay 3's door that she kept meaning to report to maintenance. She had a life, not the one she'd built from scratch, in a state of sustained emergency. Not the cover, the actual thing, with actual weight to it, anchored to people who knew at least some of what she was and had decided she was worth knowing anyway. She pushed open the back door. Strike walked in ahead of her. She followed him. The clinic was warm and lit and smelled of antiseptic and the particular animal warmth of a place where living things came when they were damaged and needed someone to hold the damage still while the body remembered how to heal. She had spent 3 years here, building something small and careful and entirely her own. She was not the same person who had built it. She was more herself, which was stranger and harder and better. She hung up her jacket. She went to check on the overnight patients. The world is full of people who have been told by circumstance, by institution, by the accumulated weight of other people's limited vision that they are less than they are, who have learned to carry their actual selves in places no one else could reach, not because they were ashamed, but because visibility has a cost they couldn't always afford. They do their work. They hold the line. They wait for the moment when what they carry finds its way to the light. That moment does not always come. But when it does, it comes in the form of something inarguable, a dog pressing his head against a hand, a piece of paper with the right name on the right list, a room full of people who finally understand what they were looking at all along. You don't need them to understand in order to be real, but it helps finally to be seen. Voss appeared at the clinic on the 11th day. He didn't come in past the lobby. He stood at the entrance with his jacket collar up against the morning cold, and Jolene came to find Dana in Bay 1 and said, with the particular look she reserved for situations she found interesting, "There's a man at the front who says he owes you an explanation." Dana dried her hands and went out. He looked like he'd slept less than she had, which was saying something. The gray at his temples was more visible in daylight. He was carrying a flat envelope that he held out when she was close enough. She took it. "The authentication verification came back," he said. The original drive and the copies the IG's office ruled them admissible as a unified evidentiary package. Provenance challenge is effectively dead. She looked at the envelope. "The case is going forward," he continued. "Full independent prosecution. The names on the drive, every one of them is being reviewed." She opened the envelope. It was a formal letter, government letterhead, dense language that she read the way she read charting documents now twice, for realness. The conclusion was what Voss had said. The evidence would stand. She folded it back into the envelope. "You could have sent this," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "The call you made," she said. "The second one. The one Garrett told me about." He didn't look away. "Yes, you called the division." "Yes. You were trying to get the drive to them before it went into a chain of custody. I wasn't certain. Was clean," he said. "Yes." He paused. "I'd been suspicious of 2 people in Pratt's office for 6 months. I wasn't certain. I needed the drive in secure hands before the question could become material." Thought about that. She thought about Pratt's hand going to her empty pocket. She thought about the 40 seconds in the conference room that she'd spent building a theory and whether that theory had been right or whether it had been almost right, which was a different thing entirely. "Pratt?" she asked. "No," he said. "Pratt is clean." It was someone 2 levels above her. He paused. "That person has been suspended pending investigation." She nodded slowly. "I'm telling you this," he said, with the cadence of a man who had rehearsed how to say something and found that rehearsal inadequate when the moment arrived, "because I spent 4 hours building a case about who you were that I was going to hand to people who would have used it to discredit everything you were carrying. Told myself it was procedure, that it was my job." He stopped. "It was my job. But it also would have destroyed the one thing that could hold those people accountable. And I knew that, and I told myself procedure anyway. The morning was cold, and the clinic's exterior light made everything look pale. What changed? She asked. He thought about it. Strike, he said. The way the dog looked at you. He seemed faintly embarrassed by this, which was the most human she'd seen him. I know how that sounds. It doesn't sound as strange as you think, she said. She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and said nothing that words would have made worse. He left. She stood on the clinic steps for a moment with the envelope and the cold mountain air and the specific feeling of something that had been in motion for 14 months, finally coming to rest. Not an ending she understood enough about how these things worked to know that the legal process would take years and would be unglamorous and would require her to give testimony in rooms with bad lighting and speak the names of the dead again in official language until the words lost their original shape. That was ahead of her. All of that was ahead of her. But the specific aloneness of carrying something no one else could touch, that part was done. The formal reinstatement came on a Thursday in late October, 6 weeks after the night. Garrett's team brought Strike through the emergency bay. It was not a ceremony. She had specifically declined a ceremony, twice, firmly enough that the third offer never materialized. What it was in practice was a meeting in a government building in Crestfall with Pratt and 2 people from the IG's office, and a woman from the military personnel division who had a folder with Dana's name on it and who went through the folder with her in a windowless conference room for 2 hours. At the end of it, the woman closed the folder and said, "Your service record has been corrected to reflect the full scope of your deployments, your commendations, and the circumstances of Operation Kestrel Margin. The missing classification has been removed." She paused. "Your rank is formally restored. You are no longer listed as missing." Dana looked at the table. There was a pen on the table that nobody had used. She looked at it instead of the woman's face because she needed somewhere neutral to put her eyes for a second. "Thank you," she said. It came out rougher than she intended. She didn't apologize for that. On her way out of the building, she stopped in the lobby and stood next to a window that looked out at a gray October sky, and she let herself have the feeling. Whatever it was, she still wasn't entirely sure. It was too large to have a single name for about 30 seconds. Then she went to her truck and drove back to Harlow Peak. Strike's paperwork resolved on a Monday. Garrett brought it in person, which she hadn't expected. He came through the front door in civilian clothes looking slightly less like a door than usual, handed the folder to Jolene with the specific helplessness of a large, capable man navigating a reception desk, and then found Dana in Bay 1, where she was finishing a post-surgical check on a border collie who had eaten half a garden hose. Stood in the doorway. "The disposition came through," he said. She already knew from his face what the disposition was. "Medical service discharge," he said. "He's non-deployable. Age, the injury." And he paused. They said the primary handler bond was unrecoverable, that it affected his operational reliability. Another pause. Push back on that language. They kept it anyway. She pulled off her gloves. "Where does that put him?" she asked. "Tired status. He needs a qualified handler to sign the care agreement." He held her gaze. "Someone with relevant experience in military working dogs. Someone he's already bonded to." She looked at him for a moment. "Could have mailed that," she said. "I know," he said. "Exactly like Voss." She almost said so. "Is Torres okay?" she asked instead, because Torres had taken a hit in the lobby that she'd never gotten a full report on. Dribs, back on duty last week. "Good, Dana." He shifted his weight. This was the thing he'd actually come to say. "The team CO wants to talk to you. Formally not about Kestrel Margin. That's all routed through the IG's office. About the unit. About what happened. He wants the people who were with you that night to have. He said he wants them to have a name." Garrett stopped. "He wants Farnes's name on the right list. The others, too." She was quiet for a moment. The border collie on the table shifted and looked up at her, and she put her hand on its side without looking down. "Tell him yes," she said. Garrett nodded once. He left the folder with Jolene on his way out. Dana signed the care agreement that afternoon. There was a particular evening in November, 6 weeks further on, when the clinic was quiet and the mountain dark came early the way it did in that season. And Dana sat on the back step of the building with Strike beside her and a cup of coffee she'd made correctly, for once hot, not forgotten. And she looked at the ridge line above the tree break and thought about almost nothing for a while. Strike leaned against her leg. His suture line had healed clean. The scar would be permanent, a pale line through the brindle coat, but he moved without guarding it now, and he slept without the particular tension that injured animals carried in their bodies. And he had recently begun doing the thing that dogs did when they felt safe in a place, which was act ridiculous with toys, and then look at you to confirm you'd seen. Firmed. Several times. She thought about Farnes, whose name was now on the right list in a government building somewhere, attached to the correct record of what he'd done and why. Thought about the others from her unit names. She hadn't said aloud for 14 months that she'd said in a windowless room until they stopped being just weights and started being something else, something more specific and human and irreducible. She thought about what it cost to carry something alone for a very long time. Not heroically, not the somatic version of carrying, where the burden is visible and impressive. The ordinary version, where you get up and make coffee and go to work, and answers people's questions with the right amount of nothing. And the thing you carry is invisible because you learn to make it invisible. And the invisibility protects the thing, but it also protects you from having to be a person who acknowledges what they're actually holding. She had been very good at that. She was not sure it had been entirely worth the price. There was a version of the last 14 months where she found Wyland sooner, where she trusted someone who deserved it earlier, where the copies went out in the first month and the case moved, and Halford got to a courtroom before he'd had 2 more years to protect himself. She didn't know if that version had been possible. She genuinely didn't know how many of the channels she'd avoided were as compromised as she'd feared, and how many were clean and simply looked suspect from the outside. She might have been right to wait. She might have waited longer than necessary, because the waiting had become, at some point, a habit rather than a strategy. She was uncertain about that. She thought she'd be uncertain about it for a long time, and she was trying to make her peace with uncertainty rather than resolve it into something cleaner than it actually was. Strike looked up at her. She put her hand on his head. The thing that nobody told you about being underestimated consistently, structurally, by people who looked at you and saw only the surface of what you were, was that it did something to your relationship with yourself. Not always the obvious thing. Not always the breaking down thing. Sometimes it did the other thing, the more insidious thing. It made you stop correcting people. Made you accept the frame they put around you, because the frame was useful and functional, and the alternative was being seen, which was its own category of risk. She had used her invisibility. She had used it deliberately and skillfully, and it had kept her alive and kept the drive intact, and kept the evidence moving toward the people who needed it, and she did not regret those outcomes. But she had also, somewhere along the way, let the invisibility become something that felt like all she was. Let the role of the quiet, unremarkable nurse become not a cover, but a self-assessment. And the night Strike walked into the emergency bay and pressed his head against her hand. The thing that had happened in that moment what wasn't just recognition, it was the refusal of invisibility. An animal, operating purely on what was real and present and inarguable, had said, "I know what you are. Not what you've been pretending to be. What you are." Couldn't argue with a dog. She'd tried briefly, and it hadn't worked. She finished her coffee. Strike stood up, stretched the elaborate, floor-pressing stretch of a dog making a production of waking from half-sleep, and looked at her with the expectation of someone who knew it was almost time to go inside. "Okay," she said. She stood, her shoulder was fully healed. The bruising had gone through its color progression over 3 weeks and was now indistinguishable from the rest of her, which was how it always went, the body's remarkable, unasked-for insistence on moving forward. She rolled it once, out of habit. It moved clean. She looked at the ridgeline one more time. She had not decided whether to apply for the position that Wyland had mentioned, obliquely, during their 4th phone call, a consulting role with the IG's Oversight Division, working on case support for classified operations reviews. It was not a return to service. It was something else, something that existed in the space between what she'd been and what she was now. Paid less than the clinic, it would require her to sit in those windowless rooms often and speak the names of the dead until the legal system had used them for everything it needed. She would be good at it. She knew that. She had not decided yet. Time. That was the thing she was still adjusting to, the return of time as something that belonged to her rather than something she was surviving inside of. She had 4 weeks before Wyland needed an answer. She had a shift tomorrow morning starting at 6. She had Strike's follow-up appointment to schedule and Priya's birthday on Friday and a loose hinge on Bay 3's door that she kept meaning to report to maintenance. She had a life, not the one she'd built from scratch, in a state of sustained emergency. Not the cover, the actual thing, with actual weight to it, anchored to people who knew at least some of what she was and had decided she was worth knowing anyway. She pushed open the back door. Strike walked in ahead of her. She followed him. The clinic was warm and lit and smelled of antiseptic and the particular animal warmth of a place where living things came when they were damaged and needed someone to hold the damage still while the body remembered how to heal. She had spent 3 years here, building something small and careful and entirely her own. She was not the same person who had built it. She was more herself, which was stranger and harder and better. She hung up her jacket. She went to check on the overnight patients. The world is full of people who have been told by circumstance, by institution, by the accumulated weight of other people's limited vision that they are less than they are, who have learned to carry their actual selves in places no one else could reach, not because they were ashamed, but because visibility has a cost they couldn't always afford. They do their work. They hold the line. They wait for the moment when what they carry finds its way to the light. That moment does not always come. But when it does, it comes in the form of something inarguable, a dog pressing his head against a hand, a piece of paper with the right name on the right list, a room full of people who finally understand what they were looking at all along. You don't need them to understand in order to be real, but it helps, finally, to be seen.